In this, our final module, we will examine the consumer decision-making process. Now, if you understand that decision-making is at the heart of our study of consumer behavior, as it reflects the actions that consumers take, and it is the process that marketers seek to influence. This week, we're going to talk about attitudes and persuasive communication, which involve how consumers form feelings and thoughts about products or services or brands or whatever they see. It is primarily through the marketing communication process, though, that marketers are able to influence us. Next week, we're going to tackle the decision-making aspect, and then finally, we're going to be looking at the buying, using, and disposing of products in our last lecture series. We have a lot to cover in these last 3 weeks, so let's get started. Now, attitudes are highly complex, and they are basically formed through our experiences that we have with an object or a brand or a person or whatever it's going to be, but we refer to all of this basically as an attitude object. Now, the attitudes we formed, in turn, they influence our thoughts and actions, such as our perceptions or our purchase intentions of a brand. As a result, attitudes are one of the most studied aspects in marketing. Now, in addition to our experiences, attitudes are also influenced by our family, where we kind of often gain our first impressions of a brand. Societies can also influence, based on our cultures and traditions and language, and our economic status as well can also influence our attitudes. Now, throughout this lecture, we're going to take a look at basically the contents of an attitude and how they're formed and how they're basically measured. Overall, we're going to seek to understand the complex relationship between attitudes and behaviors, and also the way that marketers seek to influence them. But first, let's look at why we hold an attitude. As I previously noted, attitudes are one of the most studied areas of consumer behavior. And one of the preeminent scholars in this area is a guy named Daniel Katz, and basically he proposed kind of a functional theory of attitudes. And in his view, attitudes are basically determined by the functions that attitude serves for us. Hey, stay with me on this. It gets a little bit complicated before it all comes back together. So people basically hold a given attitude because they help us achieve kind of a basic goal. And Katz basically distinguishes 4 different types of psychological functions that attitudes meet. First, the utilitarian function. And here we kind of develop favorable attitudes toward things that aid or can reward us. And we kind of want to, as human beings, we kind of want to maximize rewards and, of course, minimize penalties. Katz says that we develop attitudes that help us meet this goal. We favor political parties that will advance our economic lot, if you will. If we're in business, we're going to favor the party that kind of keeps our taxes low. If we're unemployed, we favor one that increases social welfare benefits. We are more likely to change our attitudes if doing so allows us to fulfill our goals and avoids undesirable consequences. We can switch between these aspects depending on our lot, if you will. Another aspect of this was value expressive function. And here, basically, it expresses the basic values, kind of reinforcing our own self-image. For example, if you view yourself as a Catholic, say, you can reinforce that image by adopting Catholic beliefs and values. We also have kind of a self-image of ourselves. It could be an enlightened, conservative, or militant radical, and we therefore cultivate attitudes that we believe indicate and follow through with what we think we are. The third one, basically the ego defensive function, here some attitudes serve us to protect us from acknowledging basic truths about ourselves or the harsh realities that we face in life. These kind of serve as a defensive mechanism. For example, those with feelings of inferiority may develop an attitude of superiority. Kind of counterintuitive there a little bit, but it's kind of how it fits together. And finally, the knowledge function. Here, attitudes provide meaning for us. They provide some kind of structured environment. In life, we seek kind of some degree of order, clarity, and stability in our personal lives and our personal frames of reference, if you will. These type of attitudes help supply us with standards for evaluation. For example, we such types of things such as stereotypes that we can kind of bring order and clarity to all the complexities that we see around the human life here. Now, Katz's functionalist theory kind of offers an explanation as to why attitudes change. And according to Katz, an attitude changes when it no longer serves its function, and the individual feels blocked or frustrated, or there's kind of an imbalance there, if you will. This is, kind of according to Katz, attitude change is achieved not so much by changing a person's information or perceptions about an object, but rather changing the person's underlying motivation or personality needs. So if the person changes, or their needs change, or what motivates them change, we may switch completely about how we think about a brand, a product, or something else. For example, as your social status increases, you get more money or get raises and you move up the company ladder, if you will, your attitude towards your old car may change. You may need something better that kind of reflects your new social status. And for example, your attitude towards your old friends may change as well because you've moved up, they kind of may have stayed where they are, and you kind of want to hang out with people that have some similarities with you on that matter. So building on that and our understanding of attitudes, the next thing we're going to look at, and I guess for the rest of this little lecture, we're going to look at basically the hierarchy of effects. And here, according to established research, attitudes basically have three different components. They have an affect or feelings component, behavior or our actions component, and cognition or a knowledge component. And under this perspective, which is kind of known as the ABC model, based on affect, behavior, and cognition, attitudes are developed by each of these elements. And while that may be the case, it doesn't always start with affect or feeling. The process can start with cognition, as we're going to see. The quick answer is that attitudes can start based on either a cognition or an affect, if you will. And the hierarchy of effects model basically emphasizes the interrelationship between cognition, behavior, and affect, or any of the ABCs, if you will. And again, one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is that researchers kind of like to change the terminology sometimes. Sometimes this is known as knowing, feeling, and doing. Okay? So we have to keep that in mind as we move forward. So now, it's important to understand that all three elements are required for an attitude to exist. For example, you may know, the cognition aspect, that a Tesla is an all-electric car. But this does not tell us that you think this is good, bad, or irrelevant, nor will it tell us if you would even consider purchasing a Tesla. So, but the attitude is the ultimate goal that will tell us if you're in the market or would be willing to purchase this type of vehicle. So as I just said, basically we'll oftentimes hear terminology be used to describe the same thing. Earlier, it was cognition, affect, behavior, then feeling, knowing, doing. I guess the way it's looked at today, it's more like a think, feel, and do. This seems to be the one that's caught on because it's much easier for people to kind of wrap their heads around thinking, feeling, and doing. So for the rest of this lecture, we're going to examine each of the three paths in the hierarchy of effects. And we're going to use both terms. We're going to use the aspect of cognition, affect, and behavior, the ABCs. And we're also going to use, and I'm going to just, not anything different, but just point out if it's think, feel, or do. Now under the hierarchy of effects model, basically it looks at what is driving us to want to be involved with a purchase, to need to make a purchase, to form an attitude in the first place. And that could be, it's going to result in something that's going to be very high involvement, low involvement, or basically an experiential nature. So if we think about the high involvement element, here it's also kind of referred to as the think, feel, and do kind of path. It basically argues that a person is going to approach a product decision kind of as a problem-solving exercise. And under this kind of path, the consumer forms a belief about a product as they gain knowledge. And basically, they're gaining information about what the product does, about the different attributes that it has, the strength of those attributes, such as if you're looking at a computer, the speed of the processor or something like that. They're going to basically evaluate all the information that they get and kind of create some type of feeling toward the product. The consumer then engages in behavior such as, they make a purchase a product that they think is going to be the best one for them, and they get it home, they open it up, they start to use it, and all of a sudden the attitude comes from, does it meet their expectation? Does it meet the goals that they set out for it? Now, this element kind of makes the assumption, and this element I'm talking about, the high involvement, that the consumer is highly involved. Okay, again, that's the important part here. They're involved when they're making a purchase decision, and then they are motivated to gain a lot of information, information that they can, that they acquire so that they can make rational decisions. Now, if you think about when we term something as high involvement, you can think of something like when you're buying your first house or any house. I mean, that's a very important decision that has a lot of, if something goes wrong, it could be very expensive for you and very problematic. But it's not just the price of a product that we think of as being high involvement. I mean, if you're a parent and you have a sick child and you go to the drugstore to find something, over the counter that might make their, symptoms ease up a little bit, you're probably not just going to grab a product off the shelf without information. It's not a very expensive purchase. You're looking probably under $10 for something that might make your child feel a little bit better and sleep a little bit better through the night. You may talk to the doctor. You may consult with the pharmacist. Hell, you may even call your mom to get some information. Anything, because it's very important. If you give the wrong medicine, there's something could happen, and so you're going to take your time and you're going to follow that path of, I want information. It's going to help me make a decision, and then ultimately an attitude is going to form. If that product that you purchase for your child makes them feel better, hey, positive attitude all the way around. I guess on the opposite end of that is the aspect of low involvement, which we look at, again, it starts with the cognition and goes to behavior and effect. So it's, instead of ABC, it's basically CBA. But here it's kind of a think, a do, and a feel. And under this, the consumer does not really have any type of strong preference for a particular brand. And it's only after the product has been purchased and consumed that they form some type of attitude toward the product. And if the product performs at or above the expectations in a positive way, a very positive attitude is going to be developed. But also the opposite effect could happen as well if expectations are not met. And although the process begins with cognition, there's really not a lot of effort put forth in gaining information about all the product options, because it's just not that big of a deal. For example, we talked about the parent, evaluating information for medicine for their child. They're probably not going to spend a lot of time thinking about, gosh, what flavor popsicle do I want to purchase that'll make their throat feel better, or whatever it's going to be. They're not going to call a lot of people or look online to gain all this insight. They're just going to look at it and go, that one will work. And finally, in this lecture, basically under the experiential or feel, do, think path, we act based on our emotional feelings. And often it's that initial reaction that we have from being exposed to the kind of the intangible aspect of the product, such as, hearing the brand name for the first time, seeing an ad, or the package design. All of these things are going to impact our attitudes. But in this case, the cognition kind of comes after the purchase, and it could most likely enforce the initial effect that we had when we got that first exposure. Now, emotional cognition is kind of common here in that attitudes form by the experiential effects. So in this situation, the consumer is influenced heavily from the emotional aspect. Okay? Now, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that the mood that we're in when we are shopping for something influences how we perceive the product to be. It could also be perceived as to how we rate or how much we remember about an ad that we watch in all of this. So all of these things are, important for us to think about it from that experiential aspect. So as we've seen, the path toward building an attitude depends on the level of involvement we have with the product under consideration. Products that have high importance for us, or such we could say such as having a high cost, and whether it be financial or well-being of your child, will cause us to activate our cognitive powers first. But low involvement purchase decisions, although that cognition phase is going to be, the starting point, it's going to be very short. So again, keep those things in mind as we move forward. All right, in lecture 12.2, we're going to look at how attitudes are formed. Till then.